Howdy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roman Papaduke, and I'm the Executive Director of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation. On behalf of the Foundation, welcome to tonight's ConocoPhillips lecture. I would like to thank ConocoPhillips for its endowment of this program and for its general support of the Library Center. We greatly appreciate that. Representing ConocoPhillips tonight are Janet and her husband Alan, Janet and Alan Grothe. Janet is in the International Communications section of ConocoPhillips. Janet and Alan, please stand. As you know, the ConocoPhillips program focuses on the White House, the personalities, the issues, the events that surround the White House. And tonight, the topic that we'll be discussing is religion and the role of presidents with Billy Graham, because Billy Graham is the preacher in the United States who's known probably more presidents than any other preacher and has been very visible in that relationship. And so tonight we have with us Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy, both of whom co-authored the book, The Preacher and the Presidents, Billy Graham and the White House. And so they'll be discussing that book, and they'll be more than happy to take questions from the audience at the conclusion of their comments about the issues that they'll be raising, as well as anything else in Washington. I'm going to put you on the spot here now. So I think it's going to be a very, very exciting evening. Those of you who would like to post questions at the end of the presentation can do so. There are microphones that are pre-positioned in the center aisles for you to use. I would also like to remind you that at the conclusion of our programs, we will have a book signing in the lobby. Those of you who have already picked up your books can assemble there again, and Michael and Nancy will be more than happy to sign books for you, and there are other books still available for purchase. Nancy Gibbs is editor-at-large for Time Magazine. She won the National Magazine Award for her special issue on 9/11. She is a frequent guest on various TV and radio shows. Michael Duffy is the Washington Bureau Chief for Time Magazine. He's been with Time Magazine since about 1985. He's covered various parts of the U.S. government, including the Pentagon, Congress, and the White House. In a personal note, I would like to mention that I've known Michael a number of years. I don't want to say how long it's been, but Michael covered the White House when I was at the White House, and I can honestly say I found him to be a very dedicated and professional journalist, and more importantly, I regard him as a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Howdy. Howdy. It's great to be here. It's for me a return. I spoke here a couple of years ago at a seminar about the domestic and foreign policy accomplishments of George Herbert Walker Bush. And then I was here, I think 2 years ago, maybe it was 3, this April when the Bush Library presented a special award to Mr. Graham. I think it was in April 2006, which we managed to get into the book just. So I'm going to just say, by way of starting, it's great to be back. We had a lovely day here, both researching and seeing the area. Nancy's going to start by giving a sort of overview of what Mr. Graham and the Presidents was all about. And then I'm going to talk specifically about Bush 1 and the Bush family, because I think it's such an interesting part of this book. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Nancy, who really is the brains behind this operation. Nancy.
As Michael said, this is my first time ever on this campus and at this library, so this is a real treat, and I'm hoping very much it's not my last time, because we've had a wonderful day. This project, which we love talking about because we're still, even now long after the book is done, we are still asking ourselves questions and finding ourselves engaged with readers and friends and people we encounter in all of our work with this eternal question about the relationship between our faith and our politics. It was Chesterton who described the United States as a nation with the soul of a church. And I would say after all of these years, we still haven't really figured out what that means. And when we talk about it, when we talk about issues like the separation of church and state, we're typically talking about institutions, about the delivery systems of leadership and of spiritual life. But what Michael and I were interested in was something more personal. We were curious about the presidency specifically and what a president needs in his religious life, what a president needs from a pastor. And much of this was born out of the conversations that began during the 2004 presidential campaign, when we were reminded once again that these questions are ones that we have still not worked out. And one of the things that that race reminded us is that the American people feel very strongly that they want their leader to be a person of faith. And they would sooner, they are not at all specific about the variety of faith. This is not a sort of tribal question. It is not that Baptists want a president who knows all the words to trust and obey, and that Presbyterians want a president who promises that no State of the Union will ever run over an hour. It is a more generic check and balance almost, that people want for their leader to answer to some higher authority. And poll after poll after poll has shown that it would be more likely not only for any species of Catholic or Protestant or Jew or Muslim to be elected president than an atheist. And so one of the things that made us wonder is what impact holding the office has on the men who are there. It was Lincoln right that this is an office that will drive a man to his knees? Is there something about sitting in that Oval Office that has the tendency to deepen faith or to sharpen prayer or to heighten humility? We wondered what presidents pray about. Do they pray the same as everyone else? Do they pray for wisdom and judgment? Do they pray specifically that an appropriations bill will pass or a military campaign will succeed or an adversary will fail? And we had the chance to ask all of the presidents that we spoke to this, and they would say things constantly that surprised us, like Jimmy Carter saying, well, yes, he prayed for wisdom and he prayed for the hostages, but he also prayed that at no point would an aide walk into his office and inform him that the Soviets had launched their ICBMs, because he knew at that point he had 26 minutes in which to make the most fateful decision of his life. And so he prayed that that moment would never occur. Well, we realized that there was only one person who was in any position to answer any of these questions, and that it was remarkable that in all of American history, there is no statesman, no financier, no image maker, no wizard of any kind who had access to the Oval Office from administration to administration to administration in the way that Billy Graham did over 11 presidencies, starting with Harry Truman and right the way through Bush 43. And how is it that it is possible that so many presidents of so many different religious backgrounds and political dispensations would have all turned to the same man? And what we found was that it had a lot to do with the nature of both these men, but that specifically there were qualities in Mr. Graham that I think, and lessons that he learned along the way, that accounted for the fact that he was able to hold this remarkable access over so many years. And it was our great privilege that he was willing to talk to us about it at the end of his long and extraordinary life. We went into this imagining that if you were elected president, you kind of inherited Billy Graham with the office along with the drapes, that we had come into this knowing that, oh, it's Inauguration Day, Billy Graham will be praying. Didn't matter who was being inaugurated, he would be praying. It was only as we started our research that we discovered, even more remarkably, that far from being sort of America's pastor, and it's this public figure who was playing this official role in our civil religion, that he was personal friends with most of the first families years, decades before they were anywhere near the Oval Office, in some cases before they were anywhere near politics. His first president, who was Harry Truman, would have been his last, given the way that encounter went. It went extremely badly. And you could say it was a very good thing for Billy Graham that it went as badly as it did, because the most important lesson, I think the most important quality for anyone who ever hopes to be close to a president, came from the lesson that he learned from that encounter. Here you have a 31-year-old Sawdust Trail evangelist who had just had his big breakout crusade in Los Angeles, but who was still seen with a certain amount of suspicion within the precincts of mainstream Protestantism in this country. And here you have the salty 66-year-old Harry Truman, who had been implored by Democrats all through the spring of 1950 that, you really ought to get this hot young evangelist in to see you, because, you'd be interested in him, and someone needs to explain how it is that he's able to attract these crowds of 40,000 people to the Boston Common in the winter. And so Truman, partly out of curiosity and partly to get the Democrats to quit pestering him, invites Billy Graham in to visit with him in July of 1950. And it was a very cordial meeting, and they chatted about Korea, that war had just begun a few weeks before, and they talked about Mr. Graham's crusades and what he was preaching. And they talked about Mr. Truman's spiritual life, which Mr. Graham really dug into and told him where he thought Truman's faith maybe fell a little short and that he needed to be reading his Bible regularly. But it was all very warm and cordial until Mr. Graham left and encountered that even then fearsome beast, the White House press corps that was waiting outside for him, and peppered him with questions about what had happened, and he told them everything, and asked what Mr. Truman had said, and he told them everything, and asked if they had prayed together, and he said, yes, we did. And the photographer said, well, could you show us? And so there Billy Graham, who had always intended to pray for the president after their visit, knelt with his evangelical colleagues on the front lawn of the White House and said a prayer for the president, a photograph of which appeared on the front page of every newspaper the next day. Well, Truman was furious at this and thought that the whole episode was a matter of self-promotion and essentially banned Billy Graham from ever coming anywhere near his White House again. And Billy Graham was a young man, but not a foolish one, and he realized that he had abused a privilege. And he made a promise to himself that if he ever became close to another president, he would never let that happen again. So he became perhaps the most discreet presidential visitor of any who had anything like the kind of access that he had. And with each successive president, he would come and go, sometimes through the front door in a way that the press corps was well aware, but sometimes through the back door, or sometimes to a vacation home, or to Camp David, or to some very quiet rendezvous. And very often what was discussed had nothing to do with the politics of the day. It had nothing to do with policies that he might or might not have agreed with, or any of the agendas that anyone else in the country and in the religious community hoped that he might bring into the Oval Office. He typically talked to them about their faith. And of the many things that we discovered that surprised us, the depth of spiritual knowledge and longing and curiosity in each of these men was much more than we had understood. And listening to the kinds of questions they asked, whether it was Eisenhower, raised in a very religious household, who had in the course of his military career had developed something of an allergy to churches and didn't belong to a church for many years, and asked Billy Graham, what church should I join? Because I don't think the American people are going to like a president who doesn't go to church. Eisenhower would ask him, how do I know whether I'm going to go to heaven? And Lyndon Johnson would ask whether he would see his parents there. And John F. Kennedy asked about the Second Coming and why it was that the creeds of the Catholic and Protestant churches handled that question differently. They typically felt comfortable asking the simplest and most basic questions of faith and rooting around a bit in the spiritual life that in most cases their mothers had instilled in them, and which in many cases they had drifted a ways from and circled back to find once again. Because as Lincoln said, and as one might expect, by the time they were in the Oval Office, they were in need of certain consolations and comforts and challenges, perhaps, that maybe only a pastor as forgiving and as gifted in his means of communicating as Billy Graham was able to answer. He never confronted them about their policies. He never confronted them about their political decisions. He always confronted them about their faith and whether they were praying and what they needed to do to receive Jesus as their Savior. With Lyndon Johnson, they literally pulled over to the side of the road while driving around the ranch in that famous white convertible and knelt their heads over the steering wheel that President Johnson might receive Jesus then and there and commit himself to a new life in Christ. Again and again and again, the conversations that were occurring in the Oval Office were, I think, unique. And Mr. Graham understood that. He said, not many people will go into a president and have prayer with him. Not many people will go in and tell them exactly what they think. I would say not many people could walk into the Oval Office having a comparable, albeit in a very different realm, a comparable kind of fame and global reach and understanding. Billy Graham was one of the most famous and admired men in the world. There are very few peers that a president gets to encounter, and they recognized a peer in him, and that they could talk to him in a way that they could talk to very few people because of the lack of agenda, and that they could get the one thing that every president knows that they need, and that is forgiveness. It was the second President Bush who told me once, when I asked him right after his re-election whether his views of his predecessors had changed any as a result of his first term in office, and whether he thought more or less highly of any of them. And he said immediately, he said, I think more highly of all of them. I said, why is that? He said, because I know what it is now to sit in this chair. When you are president, this is something President Obama has said just in the last couple of weeks, when you are president, you only get to make hard decisions. All the easy decisions get made further down. Any decision that comes to your desk, by definition, is a difficult one. And what that means is that the office comes, built into it, with a need for forgiveness. Because a hard decision, by definition, means there's a good case for going the other way. And so whether it was Johnson's aides talking to us about what Vietnam did to him and the enormous comfort that Billy Graham brought when he would come into Johnson's room late at night and they would literally kneel by his bedside together to pray. Or the comfort that Hillary Clinton talked to us about when she was trying to figure out whether she could bring herself to forgive her husband when everyone was saying she would be crazy too. Or the comfort that Richard Nixon needed any number of times through his long and complex political journey. Again and again and again. They all found in one man someone who was not there to judge them and not there to criticize them, something for which he would be fiercely criticized. But he would say, I am not here to be an Old Testament prophet, I'm here to be a New Testament evangelist, and I'm here to bring witness and to help to bring God into the Oval Office, something that its occupant is always going to need. And so this to us was such a remarkable series of relationships through which we watched Mr. Graham change dramatically. And we can talk about this, because our favorite part of doing this is always when we get to hear what you're interested in. But he learned with every president what was and was not appropriate. He learned with every president a different understanding of what publicly it was appropriate for a preacher to say and do. His own philosophy about the role that preachers should play in public life evolved enormously over these 50 years. But at the heart of the story was a story of very personal relationships, none of which was so personal as the one that he had with the 41st President of the United States.
You can see why I chose Nancy to write this book with. Truly amazing. My job here tonight is to speak briefly about one of the 11 presidents and his relationship with Graham, to give you a picture of just how deep it was. Nancy and I have an expression, which is that if Mr. Graham was closest pastorally to Lyndon Johnson and closest politically to Richard Nixon, in ways that would eventually cause trouble, he was closest personally, without question, to George Herbert Walker Bush, who I will refer to from time to time as 41, just because it's simpler. If there's ever another President Bush, I'm going to retire, because I can't do the nomenclature anymore. I think it's not too much to say that really, by the time Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, became president, Billy Graham had become the family pastor to the Bushes. And it's not because of the president at that point. Little known fact, in the mid-1950s, Mr. Graham made a trip to Hobe Sound, Florida, and met with Dorothy Walker Bush's Bible study group in the 1950s, long before he'd ever met the man who would become the 41st president. He went down there, he remembered it when we spoke to him. He expected simply to see Dorothy. He got there, there was a whole group of Dorothy's friends. He ended up having to talk to them about some passages that he was not really very well prepared for, but I'm sure he did fine. Afterward, Prescott Bush asked him to play golf, and Graham really loved to play golf, so they did. This is a relationship that would go on with Mrs. Dorothy Walker Bush until she died, almost 40 years later. As far as we can tell, and neither man really can recall exactly, 41 and Mr. Graham met sometime in the mid-1960s when he was in Congress from Houston. They became closer when Richard Nixon was president, and Mr. Bush was at the White House from time to time, as was Mr. Graham. But the relationship really cemented in the late 1970s when they were both in Acapulco, Mexico, by accident, speaking at a Young Presidents Association dinner, sort of weekend. And Barbara Bush and George had asked Mr. Graham and his wife Ruth to go out on a boat one day. They were together at this event. Mr. Graham didn't have any swimming trunks, probably not something he thought to pack, so he borrowed some from Mr. Bush. They were white. Just keep this in mind for a minute. They went out on the boat. They got out on the water in the Gulf of Mexico. I guess it's not the Gulf of Mexico, it's the Pacific. They decided to all swim to shore. Hard to imagine now, but not hard to imagine then. They had a picnic on the beach, swam back to the boat, except Mr. Graham did not swim back to the boat. He decided he wanted to walk back to the Acapulco Hotel, so he decided to walk back, and Ruth and Mr. Bush and Barbara took the boat back. Billy walked back. It was very hot. He didn't have shoes on. He sat down on a bench. The bench had been freshly painted green. Now you understand why I mentioned the white shorts. It would turn out during this afternoon that Mr. Graham would be briefly arrested by the Mexican police because he was on military property. That got worked out, as you can imagine. But when the shorts were handed back to the Bushes, they were marked. This led Barbara Bush to once say, "This just proves that even God's chosen people sometimes have bad things happen to them." That relationship led to further vacationing in Kennebunkport. We think sometime during the 1980s and 90s. Mr. Graham and Ruth went to Kennebunkport at least 6 and maybe 12 times. We're not quite sure of the number. It may be in the library, but we can't figure it out quite yet. But it's a lot. And these were important visits. At the same time that Mr. Bush was vice president, Mr. Graham would come to Washington and almost always stay at the Naval Observatory. It was there in the observatory in 1982 that Vice President Bush invited President Reagan over for a lunch that would lead to Billy Graham going to Russia and being the first American preacher to preach in Moscow while the Soviets were still in control. That's led to a chain of events. That happened in 1982. By 1985, I think most of you know, that was the summer that Mr. Graham was at Kennebunkport when the 40-year-old George Walker Bush was there as well, and those two people met there. That would spark a whole nother chain of events that we can talk about later. And by the time, when the time came in 1987, 1986, 1980, late 80s for Vice President Bush to run for president, he had a very unusual problem. And that was, he'd known Billy Graham now for some 20, 25 years at a time when a friendship with the evangelical preacher was politically quite valuable. And the trick was not to make that something that was an advantage, but was trying to keep a genuine friendship from looking like a marriage of convenience. These were two men who were very close, and everybody who was running that year was scrutinized closely for their sort of, I don't know how to put it, their religious credentials, particularly in the Republican Party. Mr. Graham helped Vice President Bush navigate those waters, but they were careful, both men, not to make too much of this relationship, and it was very sensitive not to take advantage of it. Mr. Graham would preach at the invocation and the benediction at President Bush's inauguration in 1993, and they were in regular contact through that first term. It was Mr. Graham that President Bush asked to come to the White House the night that the Gulf War began. They prayed together 3 times that night. And the next day he asked, I think us, without much warning, as President Bush is sometimes wont to do, he asked Mr. Graham to preach the next day at a service for the nation. That was an interesting decision because going into the war, not every member of every Christian denomination thought the Gulf War was a good idea, including President Bush's own Episcopal Church. But it was important to have, I think, Billy beside him, not because he needed political support, but because, and President Bush's diary is quite clear about this, a president can never send troops into battle without having grave and personal second thoughts and anxieties. And I think it was very important to have his old friend there. For the same reason that he invited Barbara and President Bush invited him back on their last night in the White House in 1993, which had to be a poignant moment because he had spent the last night with President Johnson in 1969. And for all I know, someone else before that, although I can't think of it right now. I remember at the end of that evening when President Bush and Barbara had Billy and Ruth over for dinner, they asked him to spend the night. Mr. Graham said, no, I can't. I have my own responsibilities. I have to get up early tomorrow morning as well, because he, of course, was preaching the invocation at the inauguration of William Jefferson Clinton. A very complicated day for him as well. And I guess what's interesting about the relationship more than what struck me is that they were able, coming after, if you really look at the long-term sort of lessons that Mr. Graham learned from knowing Truman and Eisenhower, not so much Kennedy, but certainly Johnson, very much Nixon, as well as Ford and Carter and Reagan. He had learned that he could not get too close in public to a president. He'd learned that lesson the hard way over the years. And so the relationship with President Bush, while very real and very genuine, was very much a private one and would remain that way right through that presidency in a way it really hadn't been before. That was, I think, the presidency where Mr. Graham really got it the most right, did it the best. And I think that he was helped in that by the fact that President Bush knew exactly what to ask of Mr. Graham and what not to ask of him. After the presidency, the relationship continued. When this library opened, Mr. Graham was here to preach the invocation, as he was with the inauguration of President Bush's two sons as governors. And then, of course, in 2006, I'm almost sure it was 2006, he was here when the library gave him the award for public statesmanship. And that was, I don't know if anyone was here that day. It was in Rudder Auditorium. Anyone remember that? Astonishing event. For me, I had been to many, many presidential events in my life. And there were several things that stood out that make it memorable. First, in a room that had probably 3,000 people with a lot of Texas luminaries, this felt like a very genuine and almost homegrown event. It was very, just warm. Secondly, President Bush was very knowing when he set up that day. I don't know whether you remember this, but he really didn't do much speaking that day. He had other people step to the microphone and speak about Mr. Graham, though he did speak at the end briefly. And he said, I really don't want to talk very much today because I'm not sure I can. And what he meant by that was, I'm certain, which is that his relationship with Mr. Graham meant so much to him personally. Not because of so much of what he did for him, because think of this, here is a man who had ministered to your mother, had ministered to you, and had ministered to your son, who at that time was also the president. Quite amazing, quite astonishing, quite hard to talk about. And so when the time came in Rudder Auditorium for him to get up and talk about that, even after he'd let others go first, he could barely finish. And afterward, I asked him, I said, we were emailing, because he likes to email. And I asked him, I said, so was that hard? You know, how come that was hard? Sometimes you have to ask a dumb question to get the answer. So I said, was that hard? And why was that hard? And he said, well, you know, I choke up very easily at this stage in my life. But if I'd gotten up there to say what was in my heart about Billy, I would have just broken down and shamelessly wept. For us, having watched Mr. Graham try to keep his balance over 60 years through 11 presidents, sometimes failing and sometimes doing it well, there were presidents who made it easy. There were presidents who made it hard, and President Bush was one of those who made it, I think, quite easy. So I'll stop there. It was an extraordinary relationship, and you can ask us about any other president or anything else you think we can handle. Thank you.
Nancy, Michael, thank you very much for that very interesting and riveting presentation. I'm sure there are plenty of questions that the audience will have concerning various facets both of President Bush number 41, as well as the overall historical relationship of Billy Graham with the other presidents. So let's open the floor now to questions, and don't be shy, don't be hesitant. Who'll be the first one that'll start the ball rolling here? Ma'am, could you please stand? Could you use the microphone? It will be a lot easier for us. Thank you.
Who were some of the people that you...
Is
that on?
Yeah.
Okay. Who were some of the people that you spoke with regarding President Johnson?
Well, I think our favorite was certainly Lucy, because she described...
Lucy, her daughter.
The
second daughter.
Johnson's daughter. Because she described really better than anyone we talked to about any president what it is to be in the first family and what it was that Mr. Graham was able to bring. She talked about how when Mr. Graham would come to the White House, it was as though the whole temperature in the building came down. Everyone just breathed a little easier. In her case, she was on her own spiritual journey at that time on the way to her conversion to Catholicism, and she talked to Mr. Graham about that a lot. And she said, he was always very sort of affirming of that, and said the important thing was that you're on a path and that you're exploring and you're on a spiritual journey. And she was very appreciative of how he administered to her and was typical of how these were family ministries. Julie Nixon talked about how important Ruth Graham was to her in Julie's own spiritual journey. But Jack Valenti also, like Lucy, were the two who talked about how it was as though everyone behaved better and felt better when Billy Graham would walk into the Johnson White House. The first time he came was barely 2 weeks after the Kennedy assassination, and Johnson now finds himself with a traumatized nation and 100 different problems that have to be solved simultaneously, and under a kind of pressure, emotional and political and intellectual, that was almost unimaginable. And he heard that Billy Graham was going to be preaching at Annapolis and tracked him down and said, "Could you swing by and see me afterwards?" Well, Mr. Graham thought that this was supposed to be a sort of 15-minute drop-by. What he hadn't bargained for was that he would essentially spend the day, and that this would include a proposal from President Johnson that they go for a swim in the White House swimming pool, undeterred by the fact that there were no bathing suits to be found. So after the skinny dipping event in the White House pool, Mr. Graham stays on for a dinner that evening with newspaper publishers, and he gives the prayer at the dinner. And he wrote to him afterwards, to President Johnson, and he said, you really gave me a little glimpse of the kinds of pressures and in a way that he hadn't seen before that you face. And I want you to know that I will always be praying for you. And indeed, from then on, there would be some 20 more visits in the next few years. Johnson would not hear of it for the Grahams to stay in a hotel. He was always to stay in the White House. And that relationship, I think, as Michael said, was certainly the most pastoral. And as Johnson's presidency became more and more painful to him, it became deeper and deeper and deeper, to the point that a full year before Johnson announced that he would not be running for re-election, he had told Billy Graham that privately. And when they were down here in Texas for the dedication of Lyndon Johnson's library, the president and the preacher walk through a grove nearby, and Johnson says, "This is where I'm going to be buried, and I want you to preach my funeral sermon." And he told him what he wanted him to say. And these were he said, "I want you to don't say anything, don't talk about me, just preach the gospel. Preach it right here, and then at the end, if you want to say something nice about me, that'd be okay too." And I think, Doris Kearns Goodwin told us something that stayed with me about how important it was to President Johnson that Billy Graham would continue to come down and spend time with him in retirement. She said, at that time, it wasn't easy for him to travel around a lot. He still would. He was sort of, in seclusion. And to have Billy Graham come down And there was one night that it was like the Grahams' 31st wedding anniversary, but Billy was down with Lyndon Johnson on the ranch. And so Lyndon picks up the phone when Billy called Ruth to, basically check in on their anniversary. And Johnson gets on the line and he says, I'm sorry, Ruth, that I have him down here, but I need him more than you do right now.
There's another great story about Lucy, just worth repeating one more. When Lucy's becoming a Catholic and President Johnson's having a little trouble with this because he was going to the Christian church on Thomas Circle, Mr. Graham said, well, that's okay, just go to church with her, find out about that, spiritual path. And so he told his daughter he was coming to church, and Lucy said, you don't have to come to church with me too. I mean, you can go at 11, I'll go to Mass later. You don't have to come to both. You can stay home and watch Meet the Press. And he said, I'm not doing this for you. I'm going for me. So it was just it was a ministry, as Nancy pointed out, that spanned generations.
Good. Other questions, please?
Yes. Did Ruth Graham minister to any of the First Ladies?
Well, I think probably her friendship with Barbara Bush is the most interesting and probably the closest, would you not?
Well, and Barbara tells this great story. They had a similar situation in some ways. They had world-famous husbands who were traveling a lot and fairly large families, which led Barbara Bush to famously quote Ruth as saying, Ruth was once asked, did you ever contemplate divorce? And Ruth Graham said, divorce? No. Murder? Yes.
And when Barbara would tell that story, she'd say, I can understand that.
Yeah. Barbara likes that story, and you can understand why. And she tells it better than I do. So they obviously hit it off early on, as well. I think Ruth was also close to Lady Bird. I think there were connections between, one of the interesting things about the Graham family is it too was large, and they had kids, and I think they, as Nancy hinted, these were two, kind of world famous people, any president, and Mr. Graham, and Hillary Clinton said to us, he was one of the few people that we met who knew how good it was to be world famous, and what a drag it was, and how difficult that was on your kids, and how difficult it was on your marriage, and how difficult it was on everything. I mean, he understood that in ways that maybe other normal people didn't. I think Nancy pointed out that the Grahams went to the White House under Johnson more than any other. He was there longer than some other presidents, but I think that was a special relationship.
I think, Ruth, one of the reasons she served in the many ways that she served not only Mr. Graham as his life partner, but his ministry, is that she was his North Star, and she was the one who would constantly, whenever he would be venturing a little too deep into the political waters, she would haul him back. And she would say, if you do this, you run the risk of dividing people and of damaging your ministry, and you need to, your job is to preach the gospel. And the most famous example of that was in the Johnson White House. And it was on the eve of the 1964 Democratic Convention, and Johnson had not yet announced who his running mate would be. And so the two couples are around the table eating together, and Johnson starts talking about who Mr. Graham thinks would make for a good vice president. And as Billy's about to answer, Ruth kicks him under the table really hard. And Johnson sees it, and he says, what'd you do that for? And Ruth says, because he has no business answering that question. His job is to give you moral and spiritual advice and not political advice. And President Johnson says, you're right, you're right. A few minutes later, Lady Bird and Ruth retire, excuse themselves, go into the other room. Johnson gets up, quietly closes the door, says, now, who do you think I should put on the ticket?
A related story earlier in that same cycle in 1964 when Barry Goldwater is looking for a running mate. In fact, the whole Republican Party is looking for a candidate. There were rumors about whether Billy Graham might be drafted in. Some Texas multimillionaires made an effort to get him to run in '64 because the party really didn't have a very good standard bearer. And the word leaked that the offer had been sent to Montreat, where Mr. Graham lives, and that it also leaked that Mr. Graham was thinking this over. And the phone rang, And it was Ruth calling Billy from wherever Billy was. And Ruth said simply this, "Billy, I don't think the country is ready for a divorced president." So she did yank him back to earth from time to time.
And the other, have you already told us the most surprising story that you learned in your interviews?
Ooh.
That's surprising. Well, I have a favorite story, and then I have a surprising story. My favorite story happens between Barbara Bush and George Walker Bush in 1987. They're living in the Naval Observatory at the, he's Mr. Bush's vice president. George Walker Bush is about 37. He's just begun to read the Bible and understand about Scripture and is in the process of being reawakened. And he gets into a conversation with his mother about, I'm sure you've heard this story, about whether, who can get in heaven. And George W. says, only people who've been saved can get into heaven. And Barbara says, no, that's not right. And George W. says, well, it's right in the Testament, New Testament. I'll show you exactly where it was. And Barbara says, it's not that simple. And George W. says, yes, it is. And Barbara says, let's call Billy. So they do. Because when you're in the White House, you can call Billy, and they're in the observatory, but it's still the White House operator. So they get Mr. Graham on the phone, which is a really nice thing to have around the kitchen table. And I'd really like that. It would solve a lot of problems. And Mr. Graham says, well, you're both kind of right. That's what the New Testament says, but I would really caution anyone from thinking they know what God wants or loves. So it was my favorite story because it brought mothers and sons, a topic that's very important to me as a father of sons and only one wife, and Mr. Graham all to bear in the same story, and I love that story.
I think probably what surprised me most was, more even than any of the stories, was whatever I had expected upon going to the mountaintop. And we got to see Mr. Graham after he had stopped giving interviews. His health was such, and his strength, that understandably he was reluctant to be talking to reporters anymore. He didn't want to make a mistake. He didn't want to say anything that would hurt anyone. He worried that he might remember something wrong. And so it took quite a lot of negotiation and sort of diplomacy and getting to know you before we first had our chance to go down to Asheville and go up this extraordinary path to this extraordinary house that Ruth built on the top of the mountain, and over a period of days, and then a year later came back to get to talk to him. And of course, my biggest questions were answered pretty much by the time we had sat down together in the what was it about this man. It's the qualities that we saw, even now in twilight, but you still get a sense of what he was like at his strongest. And thanks to YouTube, any of you can go on YouTube and watch what he was like, in any decade of his ministry. But I mean, there are these incredible YouTube videos of him debating Woody Allen in 1969. It's incredible to listen to the two of them go at it together. But the quality that he had of not just kindness and courtesy and things that you would expect, but of a complete lack of desire to shape the record. The first thing he said to us is, I hope that you'll just tell the truth, the good and the bad. He gave us blanket permission to write about the hard stuff and the painful stuff as well as the glorious stories. And there were times where we would be sort of probing for his mistakes that he had made or regrets that he might have, and he would offer the regret before we had even asked about it. He would volunteer, I shouldn't have done that. I got too involved there. I crossed a line. That was a mistake. And we're so accustomed to, in the kinds of people we interview, especially politicians, especially presidents, it's perfectly natural for men in public life, women in public life, to have their narratives, to have a story that they want to tell, to be extremely guarded, that it's a kind of, it's a game, it's a kind of match that you are in, where, and both sides understand what this is about. These conversations were utterly different. And because these conversations were different than any we had had, I think, as journalists, it made it so easy to understand why the conversations the presidents had with him were utterly unlike any they had as president.
One more story. Can I tell one more? I think sometime in one of our conversations in Montreat with Mr. Graham, he told us that in the middle of the horrible Monica Lewinsky business, he had spent a lot of time with Hillary Clinton, and that surprised us because we didn't know it. And we thought we knew a lot of what there was to know about that stuff. I felt, having spent a year on it, that I felt more than I ever wanted to know about that stuff. But when we went to see Hillary and asked her about this, she was quite open and friendly about it, but then she told us something that I had not expected. She was I was reminiscing with her about when she first heard about Billy Graham in her life, and she said, well, I mean, I'd watched him on television growing up because she herself was a pretty ardent Methodist as a kid. She goes, but then, and she stopped, and she goes, I think Bill took me on a date to a crusade once. And she goes, it was somewhere in California. We went to a crusade on a date. We weren't even married yet. Now this interested me because 1969, this is not your average date in San Francisco, okay, going to the Billy Graham crusade, you know, 2 summers after the Summer of Love. So we eventually got to President Clinton, asked him when was that? Because we can't find anywhere you writing about taking Hillary to a crusade on a date. And he racked his brain. He goes, Oakland, 1969. And of course, there was a crusade that year in Oakland. And he had taken her one night. And I said, why did you take her there? There was, you know, that's not what you'd think about doing necessarily at that age. And she goes, oh, I wanted her to hear Billy. And of course, that would lead to the story that he had first heard Billy at age 13 in Little Rock, when he begged his kindergarten teacher to take him out of Hot Springs.
High school teacher.
A high school teacher. Well, his Sunday school teacher to take him out from Hot Springs up to see him in Little Rock at the age of 13. So it's amazing what impact he had on presidents when they were in office and people long before they ever could imagine being president. It just is like the book is shot through with incidents like that we had no idea about. So that was one thing that really surprised me. So was the fact that Mr. Clinton at age 13 would sneak out of his house and give 10% of his allowance to Billy Graham and not tell his stepfather because his stepfather wouldn't have let him do it. That was interesting too. So lots of little things that, you know, sort of come to bear on our country, whether we know it or not.
Great. Any additional questions? Please, ma'am. This young lady over there.
I just want to ask, who was the hardest president for him to work with? I mean, did that come out in any way? Was there one of them?
Yeah, and it might surprise you.
I mean, hardest in terms of, well, it's either Kennedy or Carter for different reasons. You can talk briefly about Kennedy. I'll just say about Carter, you would think here are 2 men almost of the same age, both Southern Baptists. Jimmy Carter was someone who taught Sunday school in the Naval Academy, in torpedo rooms and submarines, who gave 6 months of his life as a Baptist missionary to go up to Pennsylvania and go door to door preaching the gospel as a 41-year-old, long before he was governor. You would think these 2 guys would get along great, and they just didn't. I think that Jimmy Carter felt he knew his way around the Old and New Testament plenty fine without anyone's help. I think by the time he got to be president in 1976, the last thing he could do was hang around with a man who had been seen to be Richard Nixon's in-house pastor. I also think Jimmy Carter probably doesn't think he needs anybody at all. So, that's partly part of the deal with Carter. So I think that was a very, very tough deal. And yet even Carter, before he left office in 1980, defeated by Ronald Reagan, would turn to Billy for help with things as president. So Kennedy's a little different.
Kennedy, but in a way, Kennedy, it's almost too easy. In that case, Mr. Graham and Richard Nixon were so close from when they sort of grew up together in Washington. Nixon was one of Graham's first friends.
In the 50s.
Starting in 1950. And so by the time of the 1960 campaign, Kennedy and Nixon are squaring off, and religion is at the white-hot center of that campaign. both Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, his running mate, certainly knew Mr. Graham, and Johnson and Graham were already friends by then. Again, even then, Billy Graham had very good friends in both parties, among leaders of both parties, and he assured Kennedy and Johnson that he was not going to come out and campaign on Nixon's behalf. But they knew very clearly, and he was very clear, I think Nixon's the guy. I think he has the experience we need at this time in our country's history. And so, there was never any question that Billy Graham and Jack Kennedy would become soulmates, except one of the things that Mr. Graham promised that summer of the campaign was, if you end up winning, you will have my prayers and my support, and I will do anything I can to help you. Well, that was a promise that would be taken up before Kennedy was even inaugurated. 4 days before the inauguration, January of 1961, Billy Graham is invited down to Palm Beach for a round of golf with Jack Kennedy. And it was Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, who set this up. And there were lots and lots of reporters and lots of cameras who were there to record this summit meeting between the Prince of American Protestantism and this newly elected young Catholic president. And the point was for everyone to see these two incredibly handsome young men out on the golf course together and then giving a press conference together. And when we asked Mr. Graham about that, he said, sure, I knew I was being used. I knew what this was about, but I wanted to be used. This was about healing. And what he said at that press conference was, we've been through this, very divisive campaign, but what we now know that there is less religious prejudice in this country than people had said, and with any luck, this issue is now laid to rest forever. And indeed, any time that Kennedy called him or needed him during his presidency, Mr. Graham was more than happy to do whatever was asked for. So.
We have time for two last questions. This young lady, I believe there's a gentleman in the back that had a question, and we'll end it with you, sir. Okay, ma'am.
I have three actually. To you two. How long did it take you to do your research? Why did you select this particular topic? And have you ever been to one of his crusades?
We thought up the book in the fall of 2004, and we completed it, it came out in August of 2007. We spent really just 2 years researching and writing it, 2.5. We had a slow start. You decide to do a book, and then you basically do nothing for nearly a year because you're so shocked that you've agreed to do this. We chose it because we were looking for a way to talk about faith and politics and how married they'd become and how little people understood that it was ever thus. And it wasn't new. It didn't start with George W. Bush, and it didn't start with the 2004 campaign. It's been intermarried, and I can't remember her last question.
Have we ever been to a crusade? Yes, we have. And talking to the policemen of Queens, New York, about what they saw at Billy Graham's last crusade, which was in June of 2005, where 100,000 people gathered together in Corona Park, and of how many nationalities, how many languages being spoken, all generations, all ages, all races. It was the most extraordinary spectacle. And it was fun talking to the cops, who were about as jaded as you, and they said, we've never seen anything like this. And everyone knew that this was likely to be his last crusade. And he, as he did all through his ministry, he rose to the occasion and he preached sermons that were both, very much his traditional message and yet completely interlaced with references to current music and movies and current events. And one day, Bill and Hillary Clinton are up there on the platform behind him, and he told the story, as he had often told before, that he had once said to Bill Clinton, if you ever decide to get out of politics, you'd make a great evangelist, and you can leave your wife to run the country. Now, you can imagine in June of 2005 that a remark like that might cause a little bit of trouble, and the Graham organization had to spend quite a lot of time in the next couple weeks explaining to reporters that he was joking. This was...
just as a footnote to that story, when Bill Clinton was growing up, he was such a good talker even then, and his grandmother said, you know, you'd make a great preacher if you weren't such a bad boy.
Okay, sir, you have the last question.
Clinton does tell that story on himself, so.
As someone who met his wife at Montreat, I want to thank you for the splendid manner in which you have shared this information with us tonight. This topic is so appropriate for this nation. I would like to make a request. Would you share with us some of the most amusing incidents that you came across, perhaps that you thought might not be appropriate to be included even in, but just some good humor?
Well, that one about such a bad boy is one of my best, and I think it's in the book. So I'm not sure I left any of the funny parts out, but I'm thinking. I'm searching databases. I don't know that we left. What's funny? No,
I can't. You know, we're reporters. It kills us to leave anything good out.
It's all in there.
It's all. And again, this is what was amazing: is that he didn't ask us to leave anything out. He was not looking. This was in no way an authorized book. It was, you know, he agreed to talk to us without condition. I think we were probably helped by the fact that between us we have close to 50 years with Time magazine, because we both started back long, long, long ago, and Time and Henry Luce were very important in the birth and growth of Mr. Graham's ministry. And he had, you know, he has probably been on more magazine covers than anyone ever in history.
Except Richard Nixon.
No, I mean magazine covers generally.
Oh, I thought it was a Time cover.
He would be on the cover of Ladies' Home Journal and Time.
Yeah, that's right.
But in his private office in Montreat, there were only 3 magazine covers framed on the wall, and all 3 are Time. The first time he was on, which was in 1954, and then again, the first time I got to write about him, which was in 1993, and then again a cover with him and Franklin and the future of his ministry sometime after that. So, and
we put him on a 4th time when the book came out. But most of the really good stuff is in there, and I hope we've shared some of those humorous ones tonight, because the story is about, you know, human beings. I mean, the thing about presidents we learned over and over again is that they're just people. They have extraordinary capacity for mistakes that most of us don't have, and extraordinary capacity to do good that most of us don't have. But, you know, in the end, they're really a lot just like us, if you take away all that power and all that influence. So that's a great story.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program for tonight. Just a reminder that there will be a book signing in the lobby, the book that has been written by our guests Nancy and Michael. The book is The Preacher and the Presidents, Billy Graham in the White House. So please pick up your copy as you exit, and they'll be there in a few minutes to start signing. Once again, I'd like to thank ConocoPhillips for their support of this program tonight. I'd also like to thank Nancy and Michael once again. Thank you all for being here, and have a good evening.